continuing in Mark chapter 9. Chances are we'll have one more study after this before we're done with the chapter. Maybe. We'll see how far we get tonight. Might get away since Sam and Dave aren't here, right? So when we left off last Wednesday, we stopped on chapter 29, right? And there's the story of Jesus healing this boy who's demon possessed, and we get into this whole situation where they have to ask why they weren't given power over this demon like they had the others. Jesus tells them, well, this one can only be cast out by prayers, right? And we talked about some spiritual disciplines and maybe doubts that we have. This evening, we're going to be in verse 30, which is going to be a repeated idea from Mark chapter 8, verse 31. Jesus is going to tell them again about his death, burial, and resurrection. And to understand everything that's going on, most of the apostles and pretty much all of Israel is under the impression that when the Messiah comes, he's going to establish a new kingdom for Israel, right? They're expecting something like what they experienced under King Solomon. And so most of them are under the impression that, the Christ is going to come. He's going to kick out all the Romans. He's going to end the Roman rule and set up a new empire for Israel and rule over it. Okay, so anytime we're talking about, or Jesus starts talking about his death and resurrection, we end up seeing a lot of confusion with the apostles because they haven't quite picked up on this yet. Peter's confessed that Jesus is the Son of God, right? They've heard this, they've accepted this, but they're still under the impression that he's going to rule here on earth. Verse 30 says, they went on from there and passed through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, after 3 days he will rise. But they did not understand the saying, and were afraid to ask him. So 2 things here is for this purpose, a purpose of this illustration, Jesus does not want anyone but his apostles to know about this. It could be in order to cement the timeline, right? To keep the timeline that he has, making sure that no one prevents or accelerates God's plan for him. It could be that he just didn't want to divulge that to everyone else. We don't really know why Jesus picks and chooses who knows what and when. We have a lot of instances where Jesus tells people to go and talk about what he's done for them. We have other instances where Jesus tells them to be silent. So I'm not somebody that really accepts this concept that we can go through and pick and choose why he tells certain people certain things. For whatever reason, he's decided that only a select few should hear this. We do know that what he doesn't want people to hear is his teaching that the Christ is going to die and be resurrected. We know that because of the word "for" right at the beginning of verse 31. That word "for," when we're reading Scripture, can be replaced with "because." It means the same thing as "because," or in short, "for this reason." Okay, so all we know from this is that Jesus didn't want people to hear. He didn't want people to be present because he was teaching them about his death and resurrection. The second part that's telling about this is verse 32, right? The apostles are still confused. This is the second time he's told them this. They're still confused by it, but they're too afraid to ask him. They're too afraid to ask him to clarify. Why would they be afraid of asking him to clarify this? I mean, he's always been willing to explain himself, right? Sure, that could be. Yeah, like Gilbert's saying, they didn't want Jesus to get mad at them for not understanding. Is it possible that they were afraid to ask because they knew the answer and didn't want to hear it? I mean, you think about it. If the answer to this is Jesus clarifying and saying they're going to kill me and I'm going to be resurrected, I mean, is that really an answer you want to hear from somebody that you care about? That they're going to die? So it's possible that they had a suspicion of what he was talking about and just they didn't want to talk about it. They were afraid that they might be correct. In any capacity, they miss out on an opportunity to learn about truth. And the reason I bring our attention to this is I think that a lot of times, for whatever reason, people just don't ask questions. We see this not only in children within churches, but also adults. Children specifically are, in my opinion, a lot of times face the exact fear that Gilbert and Keith have said, where we've done, or people in general have done a really, really terrible thing in oftentimes shaming young people for not knowing the answers to questions we think they ought to know. And so they get to a point where they're afraid to ask those questions. And then you end up with these kids that are growing into adulthood and are supposed to be serving in God's kingdom, serving in His church, and they're still struggling with these fundamental questions that should have been answered a long time ago, and they've been too afraid to ask us. So one of the things I want to encourage, especially for those of you that are working with younger people, and I'm not suggesting you don't do this already, but I'm going to say it because I don't know. Don't ever shame them for asking a question. Because there are going to be kids that don't understand baptism. There's going to be kids that ask questions about why we don't use instruments. There's going to be kids that ask questions about communion. And at the end of the day, right, we have no business saying, well, you should already know that. Because the fact is, there are people much, much older that have been in the church much, much longer who are still struggling with those questions. So we have no business shaming a young person, or anybody for that matter, for asking any kind of spiritual question. Because then we put them in this exact position that the apostles are in, where they're too afraid to ask anymore. And then they're just left without answers. And they're left to struggle with those questions all on their own. And I'm all about working through questions on your own. I think it's something more people should try to do. But the fact is, if they don't have to struggle with it, why would we make them? Right? The other thing is we get into a lot of adults who stop asking questions. And I think that this might be for, sometimes for a very different reason. Sometimes it's out of shame. And you see that very clearly in a lot of times when we have these open Bible study discussions. And I know who's affected by this, because there are people, when I start talking, will have confused looks on their faces but still not speak up. There's no reason for that. This is an open discussion. If you're confused by something, you should ask so that we can stop and clarify. That's the whole point of a Bible study, right? So at some point, we really need to encourage one another to be willing to be open when we have those questions. That any opportunity that comes up like that is an opportunity for us to disciple one another. It has nothing to do with whether they should know it or shouldn't know it, because the fact is, we should all know a lot more than we actually do. The other issue that I think comes up is I think a lot of times we get to a point where we stop asking the questions because we just don't want the struggle. You see, Scripture and studying our faith, studying the Bible, it's one of these, in my opinion, and I'm one of the few people that have this opinion. One of the wonderful things about it is that the more you look, the more complicated it gets.
Complicated?
Absolutely.
Well, question pop up. Question.
Well, you'll definitely get more questions, but all of these concepts get more and more complicated the more you dive into it. For instance, if I were to tell you something simple like we take communion on the first day of the week every week because that's the example that the apostles have given us, and the communion is meant to resemble the body and blood of Christ which has been given to us. That's pretty simple, right? What do you mean when you say that it's the body and blood of Christ? How can a cracker be the body of Christ? How can grape juice be the blood of Christ? Well, suddenly that's a little bit more complicated, isn't it? To explain how those things resemble, well, if you look at it on the surface, explaining why we take communion is infinitely more simple than trying to explain to somebody how these two things are the body and blood of Christ. Or to explain how these things are a renewal of a covenant which is supposed to be indefinite and never ending. How can you renew a contract that never ends?
How can you call it more complicated? I can see the beauty of simplicity more clearly now in my faith than the complications that I had in the early stages, 4 or 5 years ago. And it has become simpler for me. Is there something that I'm missing?
Well, I might be misunderstanding what you mean, but are you sure you're not confusing easier with simpler? Because there's a big difference between saying something is difficult and saying something is complicated. Right? My faith, early on in my faith was difficult. It was very difficult for me to remember to pray. It was difficult for me to remember that God was in control of my life. It was difficult for me to make the right decisions. It's much easier for me now. But actually understanding the Bible is a lot more complicated because I'm looking at deeper things. I'm studying more complex ideas. Does that make sense? Does it make better sense?
I like that because you once told me that Job's conversation with the Father had been it was enriched when you told me about how the Father was trying to express to him just how awesome his power was, and that became something of a higher understanding. So you call that higher understanding a more complex and complicated
Right.
fact. Okay, all right, I get it.
So, to me, that's a wonderful thing about the Bible, that the more I study it, the more complicated it gets. The reason it's wonderful is because that means there's more stuff for me to study. The more I study, the more I need to study. And so I'm in this amazing situation where my favorite thing in the world never has to end. Right? I never get to master the thing I love doing. It's for me, it can be very frustrating when I have something I'm passionate about or something that is a hobby for me, and you get to a certain point where you're good enough at it, and where do you go from there? You know what I mean? Once you're the best at something, how much further can you go? What else do you do? And for me, the great thing about the Bible, I'm never going to be the best. I'm never going to run out of questions. But there is a lot of people that don't necessarily like that. They aren't encouraged or motivated by having questions. Questions are just a frustrating thing. This isn't bad or good, right? Those people aren't lesser than me. They're just different. They're not motivated by the same things. They don't enjoy that. I think sometimes we as adults get to a point where we stop asking these questions when they come up in our minds because we just don't want to visit the complicated answers. And there's so many people as adults that are left with these surface level levels of faith, right? Where their understanding of biblical concepts stays so simple and one-dimensional because they just don't want to be bothered with looking at the deeper things. And Paul talks about this, right? When he writes his letter, he talks about you should be eating meat and I'm still feeding you milk. And there's a lot of people, they don't want the struggle of eating the meat. And so they want to stick with the milk. They want the really simple, easy sermons. They want the really simple, easy Bible studies. They want the really simple, easy discussions. They want to come in and attend and leave and not be bothered by all of it. But the fact is, their faith stays right there because no question ever gets really answered. And the real trouble communally with this is, what purpose do we have in the life of somebody like that? What I mean by that is, I'm going to use myself as an example because I'm the easiest person I know. If your idea about church is that you want to come in and get this inspirational sermon that stays at the surface, super easy to understand, doesn't stretch you, doesn't make you struggle, doesn't make you think, why am I even needed? We can have Russ go to YouTube and just start looking up sermons, and we can do it that way. You'll get the same quality of sermons. Right? Because the beauty of having somebody physically present is I can react to you. When I'm up here teaching and I see some people that are looking confused about a subject, I can stop and expound upon that, knowing that they need me to explain further what I'm talking about. Or it tells me that I didn't say something correctly. Right? When I'm looking out and I see people that are just glazed over and completely, out of it and not paying attention, it tells me I've stayed on this topic too long and I need to move on. I can react to you. And that's what teaching is. Right? There's no point in having a teacher if you're not learning. So if all you want is surface level faith, what purpose is our community? If you don't ever want to be stretched or to grow as a Christian, what good is the church to you? Iron sharpens iron means nothing if you don't want to be sharpened. Does that make sense to everybody?
You can equate that to when you read the Bible, and then you read a letter or whatever, you read it again, and you find something new to glean from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You say something in the pulpit, and you don't quite understand, either we ask you or maybe we should take that question home and look at it. Find it.
Yeah. And for some people, the best option is to ask somebody else because they're just not the people that like struggling with that kind of thing. For some people, they enjoy the pursuit of looking for that answer. I don't care. Honestly, I don't care which one of those you are, but get the question answered, right? Don't be that person that this question pops up in your mind about the Bible and you just let it go because you don't want to deal with it. And so all I'm saying is whatever cause it is, we do not want to be in the position the apostles are in this passage, where this question is in our mind and we don't ever get the answer. Because the apostles have not benefited from this lesson at all. They've gained nothing from Jesus telling them this because they never bothered to ask the questions that were on their minds. Move into verse 33. This is one of those awesome stories. If you recall last week, I had mentioned how Jesus takes our conventional understanding of things and often turns them upside down, right? In an almost ironic way. And this is one of those passages where he does this. It says, "And they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, 'What were you discussing on the way?' But they kept silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest." Now we'll stop there, and I want to ask you, what does it mean to be the greatest? Before we even look at Jesus' response, what does it mean to you to be the greatest?
He's number one. The number one guy.
The most important person? Okay. Any other ideas?
I don't know the translation, but I'm sure it's like, I'm sure there's more than just the most important or the most.
This is a personal question. What does it mean to you to be the greatest?
What, the one with the greatest amount of influence?
Okay, the most influential. Okay. Anything else? How you answer this, whether out loud or in your mind, says it's actually very revealing to what kind of person you are. At no point is the response to this equating to you're a terrible person because of how you answered it, but it does tell you a lot about what's important to a person. For me, when somebody says the greatest, referring to a person, I immediately think the most knowledgeable person in the room. Because that's what's important to me. Right? I don't care how strong you are. I don't care how fast you are. I don't care how athletic you are. None of that matters to me. But the person with the most knowledge in a room, I gravitate towards them. Right? Whether that's me, whether that's one of our elders, whether that's some expert in the room on whatever's being discussed, I'm going to gravitate to whoever is the most knowledgeable. And to me, that's the greatest person in the room. So I asked about you to define the greatest personally because it plays a huge understanding in what Jesus says about being the greatest. Verse 35, "And he sat down, and he called the 12, and he said to them, 'If anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all.' And he took a child and put him in the midst of them, and taking him in his arms, he said to them, 'Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me.'" So Jesus says, if you want to be first, you got to be last. You want to be the greatest, you got to be the least. So you take what you answered in your mind about what it means to be the greatest. And it doesn't matter what your answer was, this actually still applies. If your answer is, well, to be the greatest means to be the most important person, then to be the least means that you come to an understanding where everyone is more important than you are. If your response to the greatest is to be the most influential person in the room, then to be the least means to allow yourself to be influenced by everyone else. For me to answer that the greatest is the most knowledgeable person in the room means that I have to come to an understanding that I have something to learn from everyone around me. That I have to literally think of myself as the least knowledgeable person so that I can learn as much as I can from each individual. Which in turn makes me the most knowledgeable person in the room. But I have to maintain the attitude of being the least knowledgeable or else I stop being the most knowledgeable. Do you see how little this makes sense? This is what I mean by complicated. On the surface, it seems like such a simple answer. But I start talking like this and we start getting into circles. And it gets really complicated really quickly. So, Jesus tells us that if we want to be considered great in heaven, we have to be made least on earth. But he follows it up and says, a servant to all. And I think that that's key to understanding the crux of what Jesus is trying to show us. And we're gonna talk a little bit more about this in the next passage, but we need to get to a point where the greatest privilege we have is helping other people. The fact is, when we help somebody, it comes from an overflow. If somebody asks me for help financially and I help them, it's not because I have to. It's not because I feel like a bad person if I don't. If I help you, it's because I see it as God has blessed me with so much that I have plenty to give. If you come and need my time, need me to help you with something and dedicate time to whatever it is you need help with, I can help you because I see it as God has blessed me with so much opportunity and time to spare. And that's a difficult thing, especially as Americans. That is a very difficult understanding to come to because we are kings of the world when it comes to saying, I'm too busy. I'm telling you, I've been to several different countries. Nowhere else do you find as many people that will tell you, I'm too busy. And the fact is, no one has more time than us. When we serve others, it comes from this place of believing that we have been blessed abundantly. When we neglect to serve others, it comes from a belief that we are lacking. And believing that you are lacking stands in stark contrast to what the scriptures tell us Jesus' purpose was. There's a lot of different practices around the world to show importance to people. In certain areas of China, important people would grow their fingernails out. This seems very bizarre to us. Basically, the longer your fingernails are, the more important you are. Because it tells people, I don't have to do things for myself. That's the whole idea behind it. I grow my fingernails out to the point where I can't physically do anything because I don't have to. Because I have all these servants around me that can do this for me. Pretty weird, right? You have other countries where the sign that somebody is important is being overweight. Which kind of jives with Americans, because we all kind of think we're a little too important, don't we? But the most important person in the room is the one that weighs the most. Obesity is celebrated. This is usually found in cultures where poverty is common and starvation is common. Because that means if you're overweight, you must be rich. You must be wealthy to be able to eat that good. In other places, America is one of them, you show your importance by material surroundings. How nice your house is, how it's decorated, what kind of car you drive. Among the white-collar society, your importance is dictated by how many windows your office has. You see, you can find all these different cultures. They all have these common traits, these ways of showing people, I'm the most important person here. No culture in the world, except for a biblical one, will have somebody who shows that they're important by being able to show you how many people I serve today. That is not a worldly concept anywhere. The Bible is wholly unique in its teaching of that. Now there are other religions and other texts, specifically religious texts, that indicate that we should serve others or help others, but only the Bible actually tells us that we need to see people as more important than us in order to become important. No other religious text in the world does that. Which should tell you something about who Jesus is. Right? And this is should be adding to our understanding of what the cross really meant. Right? Because the entire idea is that Jesus, being the most important human that ever walked the earth, that's not even something any of us need to question or debate, right? The Son of God, the most important person to ever walk the earth, sacrificed his life for a bunch of nobodies. Took people that are, let's be honest, in the grand scheme of things, pretty meaningless. Right? In all honesty, when we're talking about a God who speaks and creation happens, we really don't mean a whole lot. At any point, he could just make more. In fact, he indicates this a couple of times, right? We see that in the story of Noah. He can wipe us all out because he can just start over. He's indicated the same thing once to Moses. He's like, I'm tired of these people. I'm just going to kill them. Now, in that instance, he didn't because of what Moses told him. But the simple fact is it shows us that in the grand scheme of things, we're very minor. We are very replaceable.
Shouldn't we look at ourselves as more valuable? I know you're
We're going to get there. You stay with the lesson. We're getting to why we're more important than that. But just on the surface, we are nothing. Our value comes from the fact that the most important human to ever walk the earth was willing to sacrifice his life for us. That is our value in its entirety. And nothing you say, nothing you do, nothing you are adds to or takes away from that value. Does that make sense? So, yes, at the end of the day, we should look at ourselves as more than that. But we are more than that because the person that was more than that decided to serve us. We're only lifted up by the fact that he chose to be a servant to us. And he's indicating the same thing in this passage when he talks about if you want to be the greatest, you must be the least, you must be a servant to all. He's not just giving them instructions. He's revealing the majority, a huge part of his character to them. And he's urging them to be like him. Now, they're never going to, this is all hindsight, right? Because they don't understand this. They're not going to understand this until his previous lesson already happens. They're not going to understand these things until he actually dies and is resurrected. We know that they understand things after that because the rest of the New Testament after the Gospels is dedicated to them trying to tell people about that. I've talked to you guys about glory before, and I mentioned how most sin actually starts with godly desire. You guys remember those lessons? When I talked about it doesn't matter what sin you come across, it can be traced back to a godly desire that got twisted at some point, right? This argument that they're having about being the greatest is all about a desire to be glorified, to be lifted up, to be made more important. And this is one of those things that ends up being a mystery, because the harder you think about it, the more difficult it gets to understand. But God tells us that the only way to be glorified, the only way to be lifted up, in fact, the only way to be lifted up above everyone else, is to be more humble than they are, to lower yourself beneath them. That doesn't make sense. I mean, if we're being honest, that does not make sense at all. But it doesn't have to. Right? That's God's instruction. So we follow it, trusting that it's correct. That's why it's called one of the mysteries, because we're not meant to understand how this works.
Throughout the New Testament, that's how Jesus was.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he washed the apostles' feet.
Mm-hmm.
The lowliest job you can do. He walked this earth humble. He never had a place to stay. He never had a permanent place. He lived his rock was a pillow.
You remember when he found some of his apostles and they asked to follow him, and he said the Son of Man has no place to lay his head? You're making me think of this. I don't remember the reference. I'll have to go back and look at it. But the last time I was talking to one of my friends about that, we discussed the idea that he wasn't actually asking for a place to stay, which is how they took it, but instead warning them about the cost of being like him, that you also are not going to have a place to lay your head. I think that we would be more prepared as Christians for the struggles of Christianity if we understood that when we take on the name of Christ, we take on the struggles of Christ. He was not spared any form of temptation. We are not going to be spared any form of temptation. He was not spared pain or prejudice or violence. We are not going to be spared any of those things. When we took on the salvation of Christ, we took on the life of Christ. And you're not going to live as Christ lives in a world that is like our world and not suffer the same consequences that he did. Pride is, and that's really what this greatness comes down to. It's this sense of pride. I want to be bigger than you, better than you. And pride is this strange thing that leads people to really strange places and ideas. I spent a lot of time unemployed, right? Completely jobless, couldn't find work for nothing. And as a result, I found myself spending time around other people who were also unemployed, because we're in the same boat. Why was I not spending time with people who were working? Because they were at work. It was amazing to me to see that there were two real different points of view among the unemployed. And you had people like me who was so stressed out with the fact that I was unemployed and broke that I started knocking on doors. There were businesses, I didn't even know what they did. I didn't even know what the name of the business was. I just knew that was a business building, and I would knock on the door and ask if they had an opening. I asked for an opening at a law firm once because I wasn't even paying attention. I just went down the street, started knocking on every single door. There's this desperation, this craving that was given to me because I didn't want to be in that situation anymore. But then you had other people that I knew and I talked to who had somehow kept this sense of ego and pride even through it all. And I remember talking to a guy who turned down a job, which was like, among those of us who are desperate, that is a cardinal sin for you to turn down work. And when we asked him, well, why weren't you doing this? And he's like, well, it was a janitor position. Awesome. You mean I don't even have to have training? I know how to clean. And he says, well, yeah, but it was for the bathrooms. They wanted him to come in and clean up the bathrooms after closing. Okay. You don't even have to deal with people? Like, that's awesome. Well, this man really thought that cleaning a toilet was beneath him. That was just so beneath him. That was for stupid people or ignorant people or untrainable people. That was for people less than him. Dude, you're broke, unemployed, and living in a shelter. There is nobody less than you. That's all it was. And it's one of the dangers of fixing society versus evangelizing society, right? Because some people never experience consequences for those kinds of actions. We have people who are completely taken care of and are okay with it. Because why would we ever change? I'm not going hungry. I've got a roof over my head. Why would I ever change? But we're not here to talk about welfare. My point in this is pride is not this sin. It's not this mistaken sense of identity that is only found in the privileged. You can find it in every class of society. It doesn't matter how low on the ladder you go, there are people who think there are still others who are beneath them. And honestly, the further down you go, the more disgusting it gets. To the point where people will start dehumanizing one another to make sure that they feel lower than them. And these are what we call bullies, right? And they sit there and enforce their will on other people and they talk down to other people. But the fact is, none of them are in a position where they have any business speaking down to anybody. But they're going to, because if I can't lift myself up, I'm going to at least make myself feel like I'm higher. And you know what's even amazing about this? Is that in order to be the greatest, you have to consider them as bigger than you. You have to consider the criminals as greater than you. You have to consider the poor as greater than you. You have to consider the homeless as greater than you. The unemployed as greater than you. Those who are unwilling to work as greater than you. The sinners, the deplorable. In order to truly achieve spiritual greatness, we have to consider them all as more important than we are. That's pretty difficult. That is really, really difficult. That is completely contrary to our human nature. Dan, you look like you got something to say. Yeah. Just paying attention. Awesome. Wow, I'm not used to seeing it. So after explaining or stating this idea of to be first, you must be last, he pulls this child into the mix, right? And he brings this child and remember, he's sitting down, which full context, that is a sign of teaching, which is completely contrary to how we do things here in today's society. Evidence is you're sitting and I'm standing. But in Jewish culture, the teacher sat and the students would often either stand or sit in front of him. But rarely ever did the teacher actually stand up to teach. Usually that was only reserved for very large crowds. So that's why Jesus is sitting. He's basically showing them I'm about to teach you something important. But he brings this kid into the circle and he tells them that you have to be like a child. He says, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. So this is one of those things that we have to maintain complete context of the entirety of the conversation. Because if we don't, then all of a sudden we see Jesus talking about being greatest and least, to all of a sudden he's talking about taking care of orphans. He's not talking about taking care of orphans. He talks about that in other places. But the conversation maintains context. So what does it mean when he says that you must receive children such as these, when we take it in context of him discussing greatest and least? Yeah, it is cultural, but I would argue that it's found in almost every culture. Except maybe ours today. But 20 years ago, it was part of our culture too. Go ahead. Yeah, that was a different lesson that he taught. He said the same thing. Well, that's what he says, that in order to come to me, you have to be like them. But what does he mean when he says to receive these children? Let me ask this: what position do children take up in society? Globally. Not big ones, right? Right? The whole children should be seen and not heard. Children don't talk unless they're spoken to, and even then only when we ask them questions. To the far end of the spectrum of children are little more than our property until they turn 18, and then they're their own property. In the grand scheme of things, children do not have a high standing in society. The idea that children are the most important things in anyone's life is a relatively new idea. I mean, that's only really been a part of our thought process for the last couple decades. Right? If you look at most homes today, right, when a mother feeds her family, who usually gets food first? The children. Was it that way when you were a kid? Was it? My grandfather was very old-fashioned, very, very traditional. The idea of changing to meet the world around him was not conceivable. And in his family, he always emphasized that was unheard of. The husband got fed first, and then the children. I asked you, Keith, because I'm not sure how far back that idea went. That's the kind of position that children generally took up in society. The Jewish society during this time was no different, right? You're important because you're part of our bloodline, but in all reality, you're here to do what I tell you to do. So that's what Jesus is talking about. When he says you must receive children such as these, he's talking about you have to receive the unimportant. You have to receive those that you might perceive with little to no value. Right? That's what it means to take this sentence that he says and keep it in context of the conversation at large that he's talking about. Because like I said, if you try to separate those two ideas and you try to just pull out this verse, you're going to come to the conclusion that he's talking about actual children. Verse 38, and I will finish up after this passage. John said to him, "Teacher, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he was not following us." But Jesus said, "Do not stop him, for no one who does a mighty work in my name will be able soon afterward to speak evil of me. For the one who is not against us is for us. For truly I say to you, whoever gives you a cup of water to drink because you belong to Christ will by no means lose his reward." So, there are other passages where Jesus flips this again and he says, well, if you're not with us, then you're against us. But in this passage, he's saying, if you're not against us, then you're for us. What I found very telling about this passage is that their statement in verse 38 was, we tried to stop him because he was not following us. Disciples do not have disciples in this cultural context. In Jewish society, if you were a disciple of a rabbi, you did not have your own disciples. But that was how far this idea of greatness had gotten, this idea of importance had gotten. That they grouped themselves up with, well, he's not following us. They're that important that they can be included in that statement. But, and this is something that I've struggled with for quite a few years. We sometimes have a tendency to disregard the good work people do because we don't agree with some other facet of their lives. We have this tendency to look at, let's say, other denominations or other congregations, and we'll disregard everything they do because they don't believe in this thing that we believe in, or they misunderstand this biblical context. Now, truth be told, Jesus is not saying that they're inherently saved because they did something good in his name. What he actually says is, don't stop them from doing things in my name, because if they're doing things in my name, they're not going to speak evil of me afterwards. We really do everyone a disservice when we try to put a damper on people and the things that they're doing because they don't believe as we believe. Maybe you believe in all the wrong things. Maybe you don't believe in a biblical salvation, as we'll call it. Right? Maybe you don't even believe in baptism. You got that wrong. And yes, we should obviously want to correct that. But just because you don't believe in that doesn't mean I get to tell you that you shouldn't be going out handing out Bibles, or you shouldn't be going out and talking about God to people, or you shouldn't be singing praises to God, or you shouldn't be praying to God, or you shouldn't be out doing charitable work in the community. That's the equivalent of what we're talking about here. He's saying you don't stop them from doing these things. If they're not against us, they're for us. If you're not against God, you're for God. There might be things that need to be corrected for sure. And there might be things that are damning, right? There might be things that stand in your way of proper salvation because of those misunderstandings. But that doesn't negate good work, right? Because once again, salvation and good work are two separate issues, right? If good work cannot save us, then that means good work cannot condemn us, because it has no part to play in each other. Does that make sense? I'm going to give an opportunity here for disagreement. An opportunity for disagreement? If good work cannot save us, then good work cannot condemn us. I know that was a ridiculously uncomfortable pause for some of you guys, but I know that was, at least in my experience, has been a difficult thing to talk about for some people, and I wanted to give you guys the opportunity, if you disagreed, to speak up. We as Christians need to start seeing community that way, right? Where they might be wrong about this, but they're trying to serve God. And that's something we can work with. Because in all honesty, I've met very few people that I would say don't misunderstand anything about God. I've met a great deal of preachers, even within the Church of Christ, sometimes especially within the Church of Christ, who preach things that are not correct. I don't immediately assume that they're ungodly, heathen, false teachers, and they need to be stopped until they're correct. Instead, I appreciate the fact that this person is trying to serve God in the best of their capacities. I might have a conversation with them to try to correct this thing that I saw that was incorrect. But unless it's teaching people, unless it's pointing away from Jesus, I'm not going to interrupt somebody's lesson in order to make a correction and shut them down completely. Does that make sense? Now, again, I'm only using preaching for an example because that's the most easily accessible one for me. But I've seen this in a lot of different avenues. The 26th, I'm going to be gone. Most of you probably already know. I'm going down because one of my buddies who's pursuing his master's degree, one of his school projects is that he has to perform some community evangelist project that he has to lead. So we're doing a door knocking campaign in that community, and I've agreed to go down and help him with that. Okay, so that's why I'm going to be gone. We had to actually have a conversation with some of the people of that congregation because there was a church down the road that wanted to come in and help with that, and they told them no. They told them, no, you can't help us with our door knocking because you're Baptist. I don't care. We're not even having conversations with the people during this door knocking campaign. We're calling it a door knocking campaign because it's a term everyone understands. In all reality, we have packages and Bibles made up, and we're going to go around to different doors, and we're going to leave them for people. That's the stage one of this project. I don't need you to understand everything I do about the Bible for you to go and put a Bible on somebody's doorstep. Can you imagine where we would be if we all just went around and said, well, you don't understand this thing that I think is super important, so you can't do anything? We wouldn't be getting a whole lot done, would we? Suddenly Cedarloo would be made up of 50 different congregations. Because just from personal experience and talking to a lot of other people who are married, some of you spouses wouldn't be able to attend the same congregation. So where's the cutoff? That's the real hardship that we have to find. That difficult thing for us. Where's the cutoff? At what point do I say this is the line, and if you're past this line, then you can't participate? To participate in good works, do they need to be a part of a Church of Christ? These are questions I'm just asking for you to think about. I'm not actually expecting you to answer all these. For them to participate in good works, do they need to understand that baptism is necessary? For them to participate in good works, do they need to practice a cappella worship? Now, these are the hard ones because for some of us, these are very important, and it should be important for all of us. Here's some more ridiculous ones that actually show you how gray that area starts to get. In order to participate in good works, do they have to partake of communion every single week? Do they have to understand that that's something they're supposed to do? In order to participate in good works, do they have to, get together on Wednesday night for Bible studies? In order to participate in good works, do they have to have communal prayer? In order to participate in good works, do they have to attend church at a specific time of day? In order to participate in good works, do they have to maintain services that are between 20 and 40 minutes long? In order to participate in good works, do they have to have mixed gender churches? Can it be an all-female church? Can it be an all-male church? In order to participate in church, can they have a kitchen in their building? In order to participate in good works, can they support institutions? Do you see how divided we get all of a sudden? Because there are a lot of churches that would answer no to all of those. Well, you're left with about 4 congregations in the entire country that can participate in good works then. Do you see the problem with making those lines? Jesus says, if you give a glass of water, let me read it just so I'm not misquoting. He says, whoever gives you a cup of water to drink because you belong to Christ will by no means lose his reward. Whoever gives you a cup of water because you belong to Christ. How many divisive lines are in that statement? I see one. Christ. That's the only line this statement draws. Good works are good works because they're good works. Not because the person is saved, right? They're not good works because of who does them. They're not good works because of how much you understand about it. They're not good works because of how vast the impact is. They're good works because they're godly works. And somebody can act godly even if they don't understand God. And in a world that is rife with so much wickedness, so much sin, so much debauchery, so much evil, why in the world would we stop somebody from doing something good? The fact is this mentality, this is my final point. I promise you I'm wrapping up. The mentality of you have to understand the things that I think you have to understand in order to participate in the things I'm participating in is pride. That is little more than pride. To suggest that you understand everything you need to understand, or that you understand enough and any less than that is not enough. To distinguish yourself as the line in the sand is nothing more than pride. Because you're not that important. You're not that great. Jesus Christ died for all of us. He presents the opportunity to all of us. And people wanting to do good things is not a bad thing. We donate goods to the Salvation Army. The Salvation Army, would you call that a biblical church? At the risk of making people mad on the live stream, I wouldn't. I don't see their structure in the Bible. I don't see a lot of their teachings in the Bible. But you know what? They're doing a lot of good things. They're feeding the hungry. They're housing the homeless. They're clothing the poor. I'm not going to stand in the way of that. I'm more than happy to help them in that. Doesn't mean that I agree with everything they teach. It doesn't mean that I won't have conversation with members that I come into contact with and try to teach them more about what I've come to know. We donate goods to Goodwill. Do you know that's a religious organization? You know they actually consider themselves a ministry? Here's the thing, most of you had no idea. And yet we support them. We support them by donating goods that they're going to turn around and sell. So where's the line? You need to ask yourself, where's the line where I say these people cannot participate in these kinds of works? And then ask yourself, did Jesus Christ tell me that was the line, or did I decide that that was the line? All of these things get so much simpler when we come at it with humility, when we understand we're not the greatest person in the room. We have any last comments, questions? I know I've been on a soapbox this evening, but that was bound to happen after open conversation for as many weeks as we've had it. All right, let's go to God in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we give you thanks this evening for your word. We give you thanks for the lessons therein. We give you thanks for your Son. We give you thanks for the opportunity that his life, his death, his resurrection, and his ascension provides to us. We give you thanks for the opportunity to serve and to love and to be kind and to be good. We give you thanks for the opportunity to be a light on a hill, to be salt unto the earth. We give you thanks for our lives, for our souls, for our eternity. We give you thanks for our example. We give you thanks for allowing us to be your disciples. We pray these things in the name of Jesus, our Christ, Lord and Savior. Amen.